In the spring of 2014, a handful of volunteers tried to call a spacecraft the United States government had written off 17 years earlier. The whole operation ran out of a shuttered McDonald's on a decommissioned military airfield in California, a borrowed radio dish aimed at an empty patch of sky. They weren't NASA. They had no mission control, no government budget, and no real reason to believe a 36-year-old machine would answer. But the spacecraft was still out there, drifting through the dark, and nobody had ever bothered to find out whether it could still hear us. The building sat on the grounds of NASA's Ames Research Center, its windows taped over, its counters buried under borrowed test gear and open laptops. Somebody had hung a small skull and crossbones flag in one of the windows, and outside, incongruously, an old missile stood pointing at the sky. Inside, a piece of software was pretending to be a radio that no longer existed. The people around it were about to find out if a machine built in the 1970s, flying alone since before some of them could walk, would recognize a voice it hadn't heard in almost 2 decades. I want to tell you about ISEE-3, a machine hardly anyone remembers, because what happened to it is one of the strangest and saddest things I have come across out at the edges of the space program, and almost nobody knows how it really ends. You may have seen the headline version, the cheerful one, the one where a scrappy group of enthusiasts beat a giant space agency and woke up a sleeping spacecraft with a crowdfunding page. That part is true. The cheerful version just stops too early. It skips what happened next and what it cost. And the strangest thing of all, which is that this machine had been wide awake the entire time. It had been calling all along. There was simply no one left to answer. So stay with me, because the reason a room full of volunteers spent their own money chasing a derelict most people had forgotten only lands once, you know what this particular derelict had already done. And what they found when they finally reached it was a machine still very much alive and doing its job, in far better shape than anyone had a right to expect, waiting for instructions from a world that had stopped sending them. To understand any of that, you have to go back to a machine that spent its entire life being asked to do things it was never designed to do. The International Sun-Earth Explorer 3 launched on the 12th of August, 1978, on a Delta rocket out of Cape Canaveral. It was a squat, 16-sided drum, a little over 1.5 meters across, roughly 479 kilograms, spinning slowly to keep itself steady. Its job, on paper, was almost boring. Go and sit at a specific empty point in space between the Earth and the Sun, and measure the solar wind, the steady stream of charged particles the Sun throws off in every direction. Sit there, take readings, send them home. The point it was sent to is the reason it mattered. It was parked at a place called the First Lagrange Point, about 1.5 million kilometers from Earth, on the line between us and the Sun. It is a spot where the pull of the Earth and the pull of the Sun balance in such a way that a spacecraft can loop around an invisible anchor and stay there, holding station upstream of the planet, like a buoy sitting in a current just ahead of a boat. From that spot you see the weather coming off the Sun before it reaches us, which is why we still fly spacecraft there today. ISEE-3 was the one that went there first. Flying a machine out to that point and making it hold an orbit had never been done before, and the looping path it took was worked out by a trajectory designer at Goddard named Robert Farquhar. Hold on to that name. He is going to keep coming back. For 4 years, the spacecraft did exactly what it was built for, and did it well, and by rights that should have been the whole story. But Farquhar was the kind of engineer who looked at a perfectly healthy machine finishing a successful mission and felt something close to impatience. And in the early 1980s, Congress handed him an opening by refusing to pay for something else. Halley's Comet was coming back, as it does roughly every 76 years, and it would sweep through the inner solar system in 1986. The Europeans were sending a probe, and so were the Soviets and the Japanese. The United States had nothing, because the money for a dedicated comet mission had been turned down. Farquhar looked at ISEE-3, sitting healthy and fueled at its perch 1.5 million kilometers away, and proposed something that sounded absurd. Take the spacecraft we already have, the one built to sit still and sniff the solar wind, and send it to a comet instead. There was no budget for it, and no plan for it, and no obvious reason it should work. His answer was to use the moon as a slingshot 5 separate times, a sequence of ever closer lunar flybys, each one bending the path a little further, until the spacecraft was flung out of the Earth-Moon system entirely, and onto a course to intercept a comet. The final pass skimmed just 120 kilometers above the surface of the moon, lower than some satellites orbit the Earth, threaded by hand-checked math on 1970s computers. One error, and the machine either hit the moon or flew off uselessly into the dark. It didn't. The flyby was perfect. Renamed the International Cometary Explorer, ICE, the spacecraft crossed the tail of a comet called Giacobini-Zinner on the 11th of September, 1985, the first machine ever to fly through a comet. The team had braced for it to be torn apart. A comet's tail is full of dust, and at the speed the spacecraft was traveling, even specks carry real force, and this machine had no shielding for any of it. It was never meant to be anywhere near that kind of environment. It flew through anyway, thousands of kilometers into the tail, and its instruments kept reporting clean the entire way. The readings it sent back, mapping the magnetic field and the charged particles inside a comet's tail, were the first of their kind anyone had ever collected. Months later, it watched Halley from a distance, part of the international fleet studying that famous visitor. Then it was pointed back toward the sun to study solar storms. One machine, 3 completely different missions, none of the last 2 anywhere in its original job description. This was, by any measure, one of the most overachieving spacecraft ever flown. And here is where a triumphant story turns into something else. On the 5th of May 1997, NASA formally ended the mission and sent the command to shut the spacecraft down. That is a normal thing to do with an old machine. What happened next is where I start to have trouble with it. The spacecraft was still perfectly functional, so NASA donated it, while it was still in space, to the Smithsonian, as a museum piece, an artifact traveling through the solar system at tens of thousands of kilometers an hour that the museum will never actually receive. And then, over the following years, the specialized hardware that NASA had used to talk to this exact spacecraft, the custom transmitters and equipment tuned to its old system, was decommissioned and scrapped. The ability to command the spacecraft went into a dumpster with it. Nobody made a villainous decision here, and that is exactly what makes it hard to watch. Every individual step was reasonable. The mission was over. The equipment was old and took up space and served one retired machine. The people who knew how to use it retired or moved on, and the knowledge went with them. This is the way institutions forget things, not with a dramatic order, but with a series of sensible cleanups, each one defensible, until one day the ability to do something simply no longer exists, and no single person ever chose that. NASA checked in on the spacecraft briefly in 1999, and again in 2008, and both times the carrier signal answered, a bare tone confirming the machine was alive and generating power. But answering a signal and commanding a spacecraft are 2 very different things. They could hear it. Telling it what to do was another matter entirely. By 2014, everyone knew ISEE-3 was coming home. The looping path Farquhar had set it on decades earlier was bringing it back toward Earth for a close pass that August, the first in more than 30 years. And here was a healthy spacecraft, still under power, drifting back into reach for the first time in a generation, with an opportunity to be captured and put back to work. NASA looked at the situation and concluded that recovering it was not feasible. The custom hardware was gone. Rebuilding it would cost money nobody had budgeted. Officially, the window would open, and the spacecraft would sail on past, and the opportunity would be allowed to pass unused. That was the verdict. It was reasonable, and it was final, and it should have been the end. It wasn't, because 2 people refused to let it be. The first was Dennis Wingo, an aerospace entrepreneur who ran a small company and had a long habit of looking at hard technical problems that everyone else had shelved. The second was Keith Cowing, a former NASA employee who ran a well-known independent website covering the agency and had spent years watching institutions abandon things worth keeping. Between them and around them gathered a loose team of engineers and programmers and radio operators, some professional, many amateur, scattered across the country and connected mostly by the internet and by a shared refusal to watch a working spacecraft be thrown away twice. They were, on paper, spectacularly unqualified for this. Between them, they had a borrowed radio telescope, a crowdfunding page, a stack of decades-old documentation, and no legal standing whatsoever to command a piece of United States government property. What they also had was an idea, and it was the whole reason any of this was even possible. The old hardware that could talk to ISEE-3 was gone and could not be rebuilt in time, so they would not rebuild it. Instead of a room full of custom transmitters, They would use software-defined radio, a technique where a general-purpose computer running the right code becomes the radio, generating and decoding signals that used to require dedicated machines. They would write software that imitated equipment that no longer physically existed. And to push a signal strong enough across the distance to actually reach the spacecraft and command it, they arranged time on one of the largest radio dishes on Earth, the enormous Arecibo telescope in Puerto Rico. The money came from strangers. In April of 2014, they launched a crowdfunding campaign asking the public for $125,000, roughly the price of a nice car, to do the initial work. They hit that goal in about 2 weeks, funded by thousands of small donations from people who had read about the little spacecraft that could and simply wanted it saved, and the donations kept coming until the total passed 150,000. NASA, to its credit, met them part way, signing an agreement that gave this unofficial team permission to attempt contact. But the clock was the enemy. To capture the spacecraft into a useful orbit, they would have to fire its thrusters within a narrow window before the flyby, and that window was closing fast. They had weeks, and they still had no idea whether the machine would answer at all. Which brings us back to that room in the old McDonald's, and the dish in Puerto Rico aimed at an empty patch of sky, and a command going out across millions of kilometers to a machine that had not been given an instruction in nearly 17 years. Nobody in that building could tell you it would work. They had rebuilt a language for a spacecraft out of old documentation and guesswork. Everything hung on a signal, a borrowed telescope, and a spinning derelict somewhere out in the dark that, for all they truly knew, might have gone silent for good the moment they stopped listening and started talking. On the 29th of May, 2014, the signal went up, and the spacecraft answered. Two-way contact, for the first time in almost 17 years. This was more than the bare carrier tone NASA had picked up in its status checks. It was a real conversation, commands going out and telemetry coming back. A 36-year-old machine responding to a room full of people it had never met. And then they started reading what it sent home, and the astonishment deepened, because the spacecraft was in remarkable shape for its age. Its solar panels were still producing more than 90% of the power they had made back in 1980. Its 1970s electronics still answered. 5 of its 13 instruments were still working, taking the kind of readings they were built for, decades after anyone had any right to expect them to last. After 36 years alone in space, through solar storm after solar storm and the constant grind of hard radiation, this machine had held together, and it had simply kept doing its job, broadcasting into a void where no one was listening. This is the part I still can't quite get over. The spacecraft had been fine all along. What had broken, and what the volunteers actually fixed, was on our end. The whole problem sat on our side of the link. We had thrown away the ability to speak the machine's language, and a handful of people rebuilt that language and software running on ordinary computers, funded by strangers, and reached across 17 years of silence, and the machine answered on the first real try. As Keith Cowing later put it, they had done things that were widely seen as impossible, improbable, and impractical. And in early July, they proved it could go further. They fired the spacecraft's thrusters for the first time in 27 years, a short, controlled burn, and it worked. The engines lit. The telemetry showed the spin rate change, exactly as commanded. The derelict was flying under command again. For a few days in the summer of 2014, this was one of the best stories in spaceflight. It had a verified paper trail behind it too, none of it hype. The team's work was later written up in a peer-reviewed paper in a professional aerospace journal, and NASA's own formal agreement put the recovery on the record. The data the spacecraft sent back went into a public archive, freely available, gathered by volunteers rather than an agency. And the real lesson underneath it all was bigger than one machine. The cost of reaching an abandoned spacecraft had collapsed. What used to require a government and a budget of billions had just been done, badly funded and improvised, out of a fast food restaurant, by people doing it on nights and weekends. But saying hello had never been the point. The plan was to fire the thrusters long enough to bend the spacecraft's path and capture it back into a useful orbit near Earth, and give it a second working life. On the 8th of July, they commanded a longer burn. The commands went out. The valves opened, exactly as instructed. The team watched the telemetry, waiting for the machine to accelerate. Nothing happened, no thrust, no motion, nothing coming out of the engines at all. They checked and rechecked and got the same answer, and slowly they understood what they were looking at. The nitrogen gas that pressurizes the fuel system, the gas that pushes the hydrazine fuel into the thrusters, had leaked away over 27 years in space. The fuel was still there, the thrusters were intact, the valves worked, but without pressure behind it, the fuel had nowhere to go, and none of it mattered. Robert Farquhar, the man who had designed this machine's impossible life back in the 70s, and was now an old man advising the reboot, said he had never in his career heard of a spacecraft losing its pressure this way. They threw everything at it. They consulted propulsion experts, heated the tanks to coax the gas back out, worked the problem for weeks. Nothing moved. On the 24th of July, the team put out a statement, and I think it is worth hearing their own words because they earned them. 36 years and more than 48 billion kilometers, they wrote, had taken their toll on the spacecraft's propulsion system, and without the pressurant, it simply would not work. And then the line that has stayed with me: they had accomplished every one of their original goals, they said, except the one that mattered most. They could not bring it home. And then it got worse, quietly, the way this whole story tends to. The spacecraft made its close pass by Earth and its flyby of the Moon in August, exactly as Farquhar's decades-old math had predicted, and then it kept going, back out into a long loop around the Sun. As that orbit carried it away from us, the sunlight on its panels weakened, and its available power began to drop. Its battery had died back in 1981. There was nothing to fall back on. On the 16th of September 2014, the signal was lost. The team believes the spacecraft slipped into a kind of protective safe mode as its power fell, a state from which it may be almost impossible to wake, because reaching it again would mean knowing exactly where it is, and the careful tracking that once pinned down its position stopped in the 1990s. They woke it up, held it for a few months, and then watched it drift back out of reach, possibly for good. None of this added up to the ending anyone wanted, and I would rather be straight about that. The spacecraft was never brought home. It is still out there, uncontrolled, on a long, slow loop around the Sun. The dream of giving it a second mission died on a tank of gas that had leaked empty decades before anyone tried. And the deeper problem, the one that made the whole rescue necessary in the first place, is still sitting exactly where it was. Nobody kept the hardware, and nobody kept the knowledge to use it. The next healthy spacecraft we walk away from will hit the same wall, because we still throw out the means to talk to our machines the moment we decide we are finished with them. The volunteers ran straight into that same wall, and it is still standing today. Can we reach the things we've given up on? Sometimes, for a while, if someone bothers to try. That is the honest answer, and it is a smaller and more fragile answer than the triumphant headline suggested, but I think it is the true one. We tend to assume that once we stop paying attention to something, it stops too. This one kept working anyway. Alone, in silence, for 17 years, it went on taking careful measurements and sending them out to a solar system that had long since quit listening, because that was the job, and nothing ever came to tell it otherwise. In a way no one intended, that is almost unbearably faithful, and that is the part worth sitting with. The volunteers didn't bring ISEE-3 back to life. It had been alive the whole time. The capability was always there, and what they built was a way to listen again, and the moment they switched it on, the machine was right where it had always been, carrying on exactly as it always did. All they had really done was catch up with it, for a little while. It is still out there right now, somewhere on its slow arc around the Sun, and as far as anyone knows, it is still generating power, and it may well still be broadcasting that same faint carrier tone into the dark, a signal with nobody aimed at it. Years from now, its long orbit will bring it back toward our corner of space again. And if, when it does, someone chooses to point a big enough dish at the right patch of sky, there is a decent chance the tone will still be there, thin and patient and decades old, a machine that never stopped calling home, still waiting, after everything, to find out whether anyone will answer. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the quiet, half-forgotten ones from the edges of the space age, where the machines keep turning out to be tougher and more stubborn and stranger than we ever gave them credit for, then subscribe. There are far more of these buried out there than you would believe, and digging them up and telling them properly is the whole reason this channel exists.